Down in the sunny sandy land of Australia, in a little town called Straya by the Sea, the locals had a brilliant idea. A truly spectacularly bonkers idea. They decided the best way to get rid of their rubbish was to simply yeet it into the ocean. It started small, of course. Old mate Barry would finish his fizzy drink, and with a mighty "she'll be right," he'd toss the plastic bottle into the waves. His neighbor Sheila thought this was genius. Soon everyone was doing it. They even made a sport out of it. They called it the Great Aussie Bin Launch Bonanza, and it became a weekly event, complete with a sausage sizzle and cheering crowds on the pier. The logic was simple, if a bit dodgy. The ocean was massive, right? Absolutely huge. A few plastic bags, a busted thong, or that inflatable unicorn that only lasted one afternoon couldn't possibly make a difference. It was like adding a single grain of sand to the beach. The rubbish would just float away, vanish into the big blue nothingness, and become someone else's problem, or more likely, no one's problem at all. They felt incredibly clever, like they'd discovered a life hack that the rest of the world was too silly to figure out. They were pioneers of tidiness, champions of chucking things. What could possibly go wrong? So the tradition grew. People bought more and more stuff just for the thrill of the toss. Cheap plastic toys that broke in 5 minutes? Perfect for the launch. A flimsy garden chair that snapped when you looked at it funny? Into the drink it goes. The shops in Straya by the Sea started selling things specifically designed for being thrown away. They had limited-use lawn gnomes and single-serve surfboards. The townsfolk were living the dream. A dream built on the beautiful, simple pleasure of getting rid of stuff without having to walk all the way to a bin. It was convenient, it was fun, and it kept their houses looking spotless. Every Saturday, the pier would be lined with people, each holding their chosen piece of junk. Bruce had a collection of 500 plastic straws he'd been saving all week. Little Tilly had a broken doll with only one leg. The mayor would blow a whistle, and with a mighty roar, a rainbow of rubbish would arc through the air and splash into the sea. They'd all high-five each other, grab a snag and a bit of bread, and head home, feeling proud of their community spirit and their very, very clean town. The ocean, they thought, was the world's best garbage truck, and it worked for free. For a while, everything was peachy. The rubbish would float out of sight, and the next day, the water by the shore would look as pristine as ever. But the ocean, as it turns out, has a pretty good memory and a terrible sense of direction when it comes to rubbish. Slowly, things started to change. The first sign was when a surfer, Wadza, came out of the water with a plastic shopping bag draped over his head like a weird see-through helmet. Everyone had a good laugh, but it was a bit odd. Then fishermen started reeling in old packets of chips instead of bream, which wasn't nearly as tasty. The problem got worse. The beautiful blue waves started to look less like waves and more like a lumpy plastic soup. The Great Aussie Bin Launch Bonanza was still happening, but now the rubbish didn't float away. It just sort of stayed there, bobbing awkwardly. The inflatable unicorn from last month bumped into the new batch of disposable gnomes. The sea turned into a massive watery junk drawer. Turtles were seen wearing plastic rings like fancy necklaces, which wasn't a good look for them. And the dolphins had to learn a new trick-dodging floating milk cartons. The beach itself started to look like a landfill after a big night out. The smell was another issue. A gentle sea breeze used to smell of salt and freedom. Now it had a distinct whiff of old bin juice and disappointment. Tourists stopped coming because nobody wants to build a sandcastle that's 50% sand and 50% broken plastic cutlery. The kids couldn't swim without getting tangled in a web of plastic wrap. The people of Straya by the Sea started to grumble. Their brilliant idea wasn't feeling so brilliant anymore. It was like they'd thrown a party and forgotten to clean up, and now the mess had taken over the whole house. They tried to ignore it, of course. Aussies are good at that. They just looked past the floating garbage and pretend the ocean was its usual stunning self. But it was hard to ignore a mountain of plastic bottles washing up on your front lawn. The Great Aussie Bin Launch Bonanza was canceled due to the ocean being a bit full. The sausage sizzle still went ahead, because you can't cancel a sausage sizzle, but the mood was glum. They had created a monster made of their own cheap, throwaway junk, and now it was sitting right on their doorstep, refusing to leave. One Tuesday morning, as the sun rose over the lumpy, plastic-filled sea, a strange sight appeared in the sky. It wasn't a bird, it wasn't a plane, and it definitely wasn't Superman. It looked more like a golden chariot being pulled by a couple of very majestic, very confused-looking kangaroos. The chariot landed gently on the pier, and out stepped a friendly-looking bloke with a big, fluffy beard, wearing a simple white robe and a pair of comfy-looking sandals. He looked around at the rubbish-strewn water, shook his head, and said to the gathering crowd, "G'day, name's God. We need to have a bit of a chat." The people of Straya by the Sea were, to put it mildly, gobsmacked. It's not every day that the creator of the universe pops down for a visit, especially not in a kangaroo-powered chariot. God pointed a finger at the floating mess. "Right," he began, in a calm and reasonable voice. "I give you this magnificent planet. I give you oceans, mountains, wombats, the works. I spent ages on the coral reefs, you know, and you've turned this bit into a giant floating tip. What's the big idea? I've seen teenagers' bedrooms that are cleaner than this. Honestly, I'm not angry, just disappointed." He continued, explaining things in a way everyone could understand. "Look, I get it. Buying cheap stuff that you can use once and then chuck is easy. It feels good for a minute. But see all this plastic?" He gestured to a wave that was mostly made of old soft drink bottles. "This stuff never really goes away. It just breaks into smaller and smaller bits. The fish eat it, the birds eat it, and it messes everything up. It's like trying to build a house out of fairy floss. It seems like a fun idea at first, but it quickly turns into a sticky, useless disaster that gets everywhere." The crowd shuffled their feet. They'd never really thought about it like that. They were so focused on the convenience of today that they forgot about all the tomorrows. God sighed. "You got stuck in a habit," he said kindly. "You started doing something a bit silly, and because everyone else was doing it, it felt normal. But just because something is easy doesn't mean it's right. You're better than this. You're the people who invented the Hills hoist and Vegemite. You're clever. You can solve this. You just need to start thinking a bit more about where things come from and where they go when you're done with them." God's words hit home harder than a cricket ball to the helmet. The people of Straya by the Sea looked at the plastic ocean, then at each other, and a wave of shame washed over them. Not a plastic wave for once, but a real one. They had been lazy. They had been thoughtless. Barry, the original bottle tosser, felt particularly bad. He'd started this whole mess. But then, a new feeling started to bubble up. Determination. If they could make this mess, they could jolly well unmake it. The mayor stood up and declared the start of a new, better tradition, the Great Aussie Cleanup Comeback. The very next day, the entire town was on the beach, but instead of throwing things in, they were taking things out. They came with rakes, nets, and wheelbarrows. They formed human chains to pass buckets of rubbish up the beach. Waza, the surfer, used his board to paddle out and collect floating debris. The fishermen used their boats and nets to haul in huge clumps of plastic bags and bottles. It was hard work, much harder than just chucking stuff in. But something amazing happened. They started talking, laughing, and working together like never before. They were a team, united by a common goal. As the days turned into weeks, the beach began to look like a beach again. The ocean started to lose its lumpy, soupy texture and regain its beautiful blue sparkle. The turtles were spotted without their plastic necklaces, and the dolphins could finally swim in a straight line. The people changed their habits too. They stopped buying cheap, disposable junk. They started fixing things when they broke. They brought their own bags to the shops and their own cups to the cafe. They learned to value things that last, not things that are designed to be thrown away after 5 minutes of use. The town of Straya by the Sea became famous, but this time for the right reasons. People came to see the amazing comeback of the little town that had cleaned up its act. The air smelled of salt again, and the sound of the waves was no longer muffled by floating rubbish. The townsfolk felt a new kind of pride, not the silly pride of a well-aimed rubbish toss, but the deep, lasting pride of taking care of their beautiful home. They had learned their lesson. The world isn't a bin, and looking after it is the most brilliant idea of all. And up in the sky, God and his kangaroos looked down and smiled.